Hi everybody, this is Mr. Smith. I'm currently not here, and yet, here I am. I'm really excited about today's lesson because I have figured out a way to make sure that we're looking at art almost the entire time while you guys still manage to take some notes. Before we get started though, I want to make sure that you have the following. Number one, you're sitting here at your desk in your assigned seat with your Chromebook, with your mouse, with your headphones plugged in, and you should have the French Revolution fill-in notes page sitting in front of you. As you watch this screencast, you're going to be filling in the blanks as we go through each of these parts. So please make sure that you're doing that. That is due at the end of the period. I'm going to try to make sure that this video is short so that you have plenty of time to finish all the components necessary in order to make sure that this is done by the end of the period. Before we begin, I want to make sure that you guys remember that when you are done, you need to put your Chromebooks back very carefully in the slot that they are numbered with. You need to put your headphones back with the cords wrapped up. You need to put your mice back with the cords wrapped up. You need to make sure that everything is taken care of. You want to make sure that your desks are in the correct place. You want to make sure that there's no trash on the floor. You want to leave this room looking better than it did when you came in, if at all possible. I'm going to be holding you guys responsible for that. I know you guys are ultra responsible people, and so let's make sure that we do our very, very best with that. Let's go ahead and start with this painting, just as a kind of little icebreaker. This was a really popular style of painting amongst the Second Estate, which was the nobility. So those people with wealth, privilege, time, who really had nothing better to do would hire artists to make paintings like this. And in fact, the people in the painting are likely members of the Second Estate who paid the artist, in this case, Francois Boucher, to include themselves in the painting having fun. I don't want to get too much into detail, but while everyone else is farming and working hard, they're getting paintings of themselves, well, for lack of a better word, hiding in the bushes and doing naughty things that they shouldn't be doing. And to give you a sense of just the extremes in terms of the differences between one group of people, the Second Estate, and the Third Estate, the peasants and servants working for them. I mean, you could not find a period in history where there's a greater dichotomy between these classes of people, between the amount of privilege that one class has and the lack of privilege that the other class has. And ultimately, those are the things that I want to remind you guys of as we jump into this. Let's go ahead and take a moment to write some things down. I want you to take a moment right now to reflect on your experience from yesterday, whether you are a member of the First Estate, Second Estate, or Third Estate. And I want you at the very top of your page to just jot down. I want you to put yourself in that mindset that you are a peasant, that you are a noble, that you are the king, that you are the queen, that you are this, that, the other thing. Whatever you reenacted yesterday, just to keep us going in that mindset, I want you to put yourself there, and I want you to write down at the very top of your page 3 things you are thankful for as a peasant living in France, or as a member of the clergy living in France, just to give you, that mindset. If you need to pause the video, go ahead and pause the video to finish writing those things down. Don't take too much time, just because I think it's hilarious to do a gratitudes edition of the French Revolution. Let's do that really quick. When you're done, press play and keep going with the video. Go ahead and write that down now. Okay. Looking at our objectives, just as a reminder, we should have written these things down on our folded over page in our notebook. Understand the inequality of the old regime that led to the French Revolution. Understand the financial crises in France that led to the revolution. We sort of explored both of those yesterday. In the farming, we experienced a lot of that inequality, and I began explaining to you guys that financial crisis. I want to focus on that financial crisis a little bit more today. And then finally, how did the Enlightenment influence the French Revolution? When we did our farming reenactment, we saw firsthand how taxation by the national government, King Louis here, by the tithes from the church here. So this is the First Estate, which is the Roman Catholic clergy. This is the First Estate, which is the Roman Catholic clergy, right? The way in which their tithes added on extra taxes to the Third Estate down here, who have to carry the weight, literally, for everybody else. King Louis XVI and his Queen Marie Antoinette, the way in which their taxation ultimately, like I love how they're using him like a horse, like a gagging mechanism. They're all trying to ride on the back of the third estate, right? And over here, we've got the second estate, which are the noble lords. And please make sure you're filling this out as we go. So the first estate here is the Roman Catholic clergy who had tithes, right, paid for by the members of the third estate. Over here, we've got our second estate, who are supposed to be defending the nation, right, but ultimately are utilizing the taxation on the third estate to make themselves wealthy and to have wonderful paintings like that painting that I showed you earlier. And then, last but not least, we've got our third estate right here. Who ultimately has to pay vast quantities of taxes. And as a result, is poverty-stricken. As a result, their life is extremely difficult. So we've got a clear indication of the inequality that exists within the old regime. Guess who this guy is? I love this painting. This is a painting of Louis XVI. Louis XVI had this portrait painted of him inspired by a painting of his great-grandfather, Louis XIV, who was one of the most powerful kings in all of France. Let's go ahead and take a look at that painting just so we can compare them. This painting right here, when it was painted in the 1500s, was an image that was associated with immense power. His legs were being displayed, and his heels were being displayed to make him look taller, because they were supposed to illustrate his strength, right? Obviously, his sword is displayed here, his wonderful wig. All of these elements were considered, believe it or not, as crazy as it sounds, masculine. The incorporation of a Greek column of all of these elements were considered to be masculine. So here we have Louis XVI doing the same thing. Look at the way in which he displays all of the same elements. The portrait is almost exactly identical. So he's trying to make a connection between himself and his grandfather, this incredibly powerful king, and himself, to say something about the power that he has. The simple fact of the matter is he was not a very powerful king. He was a mostly ineffective king who spent, as we found out yesterday, most of his time at the Palace of Versailles, doing his own thing. And his wife, here, wonderful image of his wife, being portrayed as this wonderful mother. In fact, she was very young. She had her children that were very young, and she didn't do anything to take care of them. She had nurses and various other people take care of them all the time, and she spent time having lavish balls and things like that. So trying to create a portrayal of her as a mother, right? Why would you want to do that? Because she's supposed to be the mother of the country. Of course, she was as terrible a mother as she was to her children as she was to France. I just found this image on the internet, had to show it to you. This, I think, is what most French people thought about when they considered the likes of Marie Antoinette and her close confidants. They seemed ridiculous. They seemed over the top. They spent vast quantities of money on decorating themselves and their surroundings. These images right here were actually painted around the exact same time. And the reason why I want to show them to you is I wanted to sort of demonstrate that because of the vast inequality that had resulted in this estate system, right, first estate, second estate, and third estate, ultimately you have two profoundly different styles of art that represent, on the one hand, a style of art that represents the Enlightenment ideas, and another style of art that ultimately represents this old system. That style of art is indicating, or these two distinct styles of art are indicating that there's a separation in the way in which people understand and believe the world should be. Obviously, people engaging in art like this believe the world should be one way, and people engaging in things like this believe the world should be another way. And so ultimately, as we explore the French Revolution, we realize that all of these things are going to be coming to a head. Let's talk a little bit about the financial crisis that the French were in. The French were in a grave financial crisis mainly because they spent way too much money. They began going into debt in the French and Indian War. This is an image, a British image of the French and Indian War that we're looking at, the death of Benjamin Wolfe. And you can see an actual Native American over here, in which the British were fighting the French. The British would ultimately win that war, but at huge cost to the British and huge cost for the French. So the French and Indian War put France into debt. They continued to fight multiple wars against the British, and when the American Revolution broke out, the French willingly, and this is an image showing the sea battles, right? So and this was the main role that the French played in the American Revolution, was the United States the new colonies really didn't have a navy of any significance. And so the French played a role in fighting the British off the coasts of America. And so ultimately, the French utilized that as an opportunity to weaken the British. Why did they want to weaken the British so badly? Because this was part of the greater religious wars that had been going on for the last 100 years. Those religious wars were fought all over Europe, and they included the wars between the French and the British, but also the French and Protestants throughout Europe. There were large Protestant populations in Germany, Austria, Prussia, which is a country that doesn't exist any longer but will be part of Germany. So those wars became increasingly expensive, and ultimately the French king, as the defender of the Catholic faith, felt that it was necessary, allied with the Spanish and the Italians, to fight the Protestants wherever they were, including in their own country. This image here actually shows the Catholics kicking Protestants out of France itself. So this is in the city of Rochelle, where they are tracking down all the Protestants within the city and kicking them out of the city. So you've got the American Revolution, and this is an image of George Washington and French generals working together to fight the British. And that fighting of the British, yes, the French were helping the Americans, but simultaneously they were also helping to weaken the British. That fight to weaken the British was largely based on this desire to get rid of the Protestant population and to defend the Catholic faith. And so all of those things cost tremendous amounts of money, not to mention the Palace of Versailles, the palace with which the King Louis XVI lived in. Now, much of the Palace of Versailles was built under Louis XIV, but most of the kings, Louis XV and Louis XVI, continued to expand those palaces. After the death of Louis XIV, and with the ushering in of Louis XV, a lot of the sort of magnetic personality that the king had under Louis XV, he really kept the nobles at the Palace of Versailles, which had something like 300 rooms. He really kept all the nobility staying in that place, and they revolved around him. It's another reason why they called him the Sun King, was because he had a sort of gravitational pull on the nobility from throughout Europe. So they got used to living in this incredibly lavish palace, the nobles did. And actually, when Louis XV died and Louis XV came to power, those nobles no longer stayed in the Palace of Versailles. They went back home, and they wanted palaces like the Palace of Versailles for themselves. So they oftentimes utilized taxation and things like that to try and build their own small manors and palaces of this kind of palatial status. But under Louis XVI, he continued to have nobles come to the Palace of Versailles. They put on very lavish parties for the nobles to illustrate their power and their wealth. And so the palace itself, as well as the parties that they had there, all of these things ultimately cost immense quantities of money. By the way, just on a sort of a side note, but also in terms of money, one of Louis XVI's favorite pastimes, his hobbies, was buying really expensive clocks, taking them apart, and then reassembling them. One of Marie Antoinette's favorite hobbies was having dollhouses, oftentimes dollhouses that were decorated as lavishly as the Palace of Versailles. Again, just a reminder, this is a hallway in the Palace of Versailles. It's called the Hall of Mirrors. So this isn't even a main bedroom. It's not even a main throne room. It's just a hallway. And the fact that it's covered in marble and gold and crystal chandeliers is just over the top. So clearly, all of this stuff, when taken together, is going to create a financial crisis, the likes of which almost no European country has ever seen. The debt got greater, grew and grew and grew and grew until they were buried under it, and there was little that they could do about that. That was coupled with a series of crises regarding food. And it's worth noting that the growing of grain and the milling of grain into flour was a key component of how many people made money in France. Now, obviously, there are lots and lots of other jobs that people did, and they grew lots of other things. But bread was a staple of the French diet, and bread primarily utilized milled wheat right, which we know as flour. So that's a really important cornerstone. When you were engaging in your reenactment, there's a reason why we chose to do that in reenactment, growing wheat, because ultimately wheat was the staple for the population. Wheat was the source of major wealth. Wheat brokers, who were the people who bought and sold wheat from farmers to millers, ultimately the people that would mill the wheat, played an important role in the sort of setting the prices for the price of wheat. And oftentimes the price of wheat in France for a really long time was set by the French government. However, during the 1700s, in the period of the Enlightenment, there were new ideas about economy, how an economy should run, and many of those ideas were introduced by one of the most influential economists ever to live on this earth, a man named Adam Smith, who basically brought to us, in his book called The Wealth of Nations, a concept called capitalism. Here's a quote from that book. It says, "It is not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest." What a powerful quote, because what it results in, or what it explains to us, is that these guys do not create these goods. They do not create, the baker does not create bread because he cares about us, because his regard for us. Rather, he creates bread out of his own self-interest, because ultimately it's through bread that he will make his money. Right? And so what Adam Smith is ultimately saying here is that you do not need the French government to set the price of bread or to set the price of grain or flour, because ultimately everybody will do the things that are in their own self-interest. But those things that they do in their own self-interest will ultimately they will benefit the masses, right? I will become a baker, not because I want to help people have food, but because I see the profit in making bread for people. I will become a brewer or a butcher, not because I like to slaughter pigs, but because I see the benefit, the financial benefit in engaging in this for myself, right? In other words, if everybody just if the governments take their hands out of the system and they don't try to set prices, prices will set themselves naturally. Nobody has to build a big economy. It's just going to naturally work itself out. This is the concept of the invisible hand, right? So it's the enlightened economist Adam Smith's idea that no one person has to plan an economy. That shouldn't be and. It should be N-A-N. No one has to plan an economy, right? When the baker is ultimately baking bread, is he thinking about the larger prices of wheat and eggs and how many people there are in France and how many people need to have bread? No. He's just making bread and he's going to go out there and he's going to sell it. He doesn't have to think about the big picture. Neither does the government. The government doesn't have to go to that baker and say, we need you to grow this much or to bake this much bread. Ultimately, he's going to bake as much as he can. And if he doesn't meet the demand, then someone else will realize ultimately that because the demand is not being met, he can sell his bread for really high prices. Someone else is going to see that opportunity of selling bread for really high prices. They're going to come into that market. They're going to start selling bread for that really high price. When that happens, it's going to drive the price of bread down until you get as many bakers as you can baking bread until you've got an oversupply. Once you've got an oversupply, the prices will start coming down. Someone else will go out of business. And when that happens, you're going to end up having essentially supplied the amount of bread that people demand. And that, at its core, is the concept of capitalism. So, therefore, Adam Smith was one of the first people to argue that a government doesn't need to get involved. And this is the second bullet point under the food crisis portion. Laissez-faire is a French term meaning that the government will keep its hands out of business. The government will not set prices. The government will not tell people what to grow. The government will not tell people how much to make, right? The government will mind its own business and everything will work itself out. So laissez-faire is a government policy of not intervening in markets. In the example that we're discussing here, the French government is not going to set grain prices in the grain market, right? The French government is not going to set grain prices in the grain market. Traditionally, before Adam Smith, they set the grain price. And by setting the grain price, that meant that farmers were going to get a certain price for their grain. So let's say the French ultimately set the grain price, the French government sets the grain price at, I don't know, 10 francs a pound, and they don't use a pound because a pound is an English system, but whatever. $10, 10 francs. I don't know what the franc symbol is. They don't even use the franc anymore. Whatever. A pound. So if there's an oversupply, they're going to pay $10 a pound anyway, right? If they decide to go with the laissez-faire model, which they did decide to do in around 1785, they decided to go with the laissez-faire model, and the government got out of doing this. Well, all of these people who normally supplied grain and expected to get that set price are no longer going to get that set price. If the prices are set, you're going to end up having too much supply, regardless of the demand. As a result, if you no longer set the prices, too much supply is going to lead to an oversupply, which is going to drive down prices. And this is exactly what happened in 1784, 1785, is that prices collapsed in the grain market. And when prices collapsed in the grain market, people weren't able to make enough money to take care of their family. And so in reality, this is the crisis that we sort of experienced when we did this. People were growing food, but ultimately the prices, the amount of money they were getting for what they were growing was not what it used to be. And as a result, they couldn't buy as much as they needed in order to survive for them and their family. And so this literally led to a crisis that would lead to famine, right? At one point in 1785, the price of flour had gone, the price of flour had gone up so high, right? Because what happened in 1784 is people grew too much grain, the prices went down, and so there was too much flour, and so the next year people stopped growing grain. Well, they overreacted and ended up not growing enough grain, and so the very little grain there was milled into flour, and the small amount of grain was really, really expensive, and so your average person couldn't afford to buy bread. And so that led to the flour wars, which were riots in France over the small amount of flour and the extremely high prices as a result of high demand and low supply, right? So let's be very clear about that the last three blanks, because it's kind of complicated. So there's a small amount of flour that's going to lead to, the first blank, high price. Okay, the high price is the result of high demand. The higher demand there is for a good, the higher the price is going to be, right? When there's high prices, that typically means that there's large amount of demand and there's very little supply. And that's exactly what happened in 1785. Let's move on to the meeting of the States General. So there's, at one point, not enough food. Simultaneously, the food is too expensive. While that's going on, there's a vast quantity of inequality between the treatment of the third estate versus the first and second estate. Financially, the government has mismanaged its finances, allowing the king and the nobles to have probably far too much money, while simultaneously mismanaging these wars, resulting in massive debts. And around 1788, the king understood this. The king, who didn't really like to get involved in politics, even though it was his job, began to understand that there was a severe problem. So by 1789, the people of France ultimately realized that the French government was in dire straits, right? The French economy and the French people were in dire straits. So there was a very, very, very serious problem that people understood was ongoing. People understood that the food crisis could lead to riots. People understood that if there wasn't enough money to pay for the debts, then the Austrians, who we owed money to, and the Prussians, who we owed money to, and the Italians, who we owed money to, and the Spanish, who we owed money to, they could likely invade the country in order to try and get their money back, right? So this could lead to widespread war. It could lead to panic. It could lead to wars with other countries. It could lead to civil war. All of these were real problems that people were really worried about, and ultimately it was not a situation that people wanted to live in, and so they knew that something had to be done. Louis XVI was very hesitant to call a meeting of the Estates General because ultimately a meeting of the Estates General would give other people power. And this guy, Louis XVI, was a monarch who was supposed to have absolute power. But he had a financial advisor by the name of Jacques Necker who advised him that he should call a meeting of the Estates General because it would be easier for him to pin the problems of France on someone else in the meeting of the Estates General. Ultimately, Jacques Necker wanted Louis XVI to sort of pin all of these problems on the members of the Second Estate, the nobility. He believed that the members of the First Estate and the Third Estate would side together to ultimately pin a lot of these issues on the Second Estate and thereby raise taxes on the Second Estate, who, by the way, had a lot of money. And in raising taxes on the Second Estate, they would have enough money to pay off their debts and to simultaneously perhaps buy grain and or flour from other countries and things like that. So Jacques Necker's plan, Jacques Necker, and Necker is spelled Necker, his plan was ultimately to try and pin these problems on the Second Estate, utilizing the voting system, and then to raise taxes on the nobles, right? So they wanted to raise taxes on the nobles and to use that money to solve these problems. Okay, and the reason why this would work is that traditionally the estates voted by head, meaning each estate got one vote. And so Necker believed that the King Louis XVI, could get the First Estate and the Third Estate to each have one vote and to vote to raise taxes on the noble lords, which were the Second Estate, right? That is not what ended up happening, per se, and when we engage in our reenactment tomorrow, you guys are going to make a call as to how you guys want this to play out, how you guys want to solve these problems. But ultimately, it's going to be your responsibility in the reenactment on Friday to solve these problems, which is one of the reasons why we're doing this, so you can see very clearly that there are three major problems. One, the inequality that people were experiencing. Two, an array of financial issues that the French were unable to deal with, and then finally this massive food crisis which was leading to famine and starvation across the country, which absolutely had to be dealt with, right? Last but not least, we should consider the role the Enlightenment plays in this. When someone who's an enlightened thinker in France looks at these problems, what are they going to say? What are they going to say is at the heart of the problem? How do you think they're going to think about solving this, right? So the last bullet point here says French Enlightenment thinkers discussed voting more blank. In this particular case, those people who were influenced by the Enlightenment, when they were showing up to the meeting of the Estates General, they were talking about and discussing the idea of voting more democratically, right? Instead of having three total votes, one from the First Estate, one from the Second Estate, one from the Third Estate, the Enlightenment thinkers thought, hey, if we make this more democratic and we allow each person to have a vote, right, then we're an organization that is the voice of the French people, and that's a more democratic process. Of course, that's not what the king wants at all. That's the screencast. I want to take this moment right now to remind all of you to make sure that when you put your Chromebooks back, that you put them with the plug facing out at the top so the number is facing upward. You plug that sucker in, make sure it's in the right slot, make sure you wrap up your mice, wrap up your headphones, and put everything in the correct spot. Clean up around your desks, clean up any paper off the floor, make sure your desks are aligned. Last but not least, before you turn in your handout, make sure that you've come up with 3 good study questions and you've summarized your notes on the bottom. There's also an activity for you to do on the back side. The activity for you to do on the back side is to draw a symbol that represents and addresses the needs of your estate for the meeting of the Estates General. And what we're going to do is we're going to try to show these at the meeting of the Estates General, right? What is your symbol? What are the things in your symbol that address the needs of your particular estate? Are the needs of your estate different from the other states? How can that be represented in your symbol? So again, make sure you do your 3 questions, make sure you do your summary, and make sure you do your symbol on the back that addresses the needs of your estate. All right, guys, I hope you guys enjoy the rest of class and you get the rest of this done. Make sure you turn it into the substitute, and we will look back at it on Friday when we do our reenactment. Have a wonderful day, and I will see you then.